Hey there guys, welcome to my videography on Mannerism. This is an art style that developed in Italy and Europe during the early 1500s, 1520 through 1600. My name is Hodge Wasson. This is presented to Art 127, Art History 2, Spring Quarter 2016. Today's date is 6/7, 2016. Mannerism can be very difficult to define, but mostly it can be defined as a reaction to the perfection of the Renaissance. Mannerism was an art style that focused on the human form, depicted in intricate poses and in exaggerated, not always realistic settings. The term Mannerism was derived from the Italian word manera, which translates directly as style. It developed in Florence and Rome between 1520 and 1600 as a style that rejected the balance and naturalism of the Renaissance period in favor of a more emotional and distorted point of view. Paintings contained artificial color and unrealistic spatial proportions. Figures often had elongated limbs and exaggerated and twisted positions. Works of the period were often deliberately unsettling and strange, probably as a result of the time period's upheaval from the plague and the sack of Rome. Mannerism was not created to serve the objectives of either the Reformation or the Counter Reformation movements, the split between the Roman Catholic and Protestantism, which was to be the specific role of the Baroque. Thus, there had to have been an independent, wholly aesthetic incentive, and there was. Mannerism was first and foremost a violent reaction to and a dramatic departure from the ideal and perfected art of the Renaissance. Let's take a closer look at a few individual paintings. I chose this picture, Madonna with the Long Neck by Parmigiano, because to me it best typifies and encapsulates the Mannerist style to follow. The painting depicts the Virgin Mary and is properly called Madonna of the Long Neck because the painter, in his eagerness to make the Holy Virgin look graceful and elegant, has given her a neck like that of a swan. Seated on a high pedestal in luxurious robes, holding a rather large baby Jesus in her lap, six angels are crammed together on the Madonna's right, giving the painting an overall feeling of imbalance. Another Mannerist favorite theme. He wanted to show that the classical solution of perfect harmony is not the only solution conceivable. Parmigiano and all the artists of his time deliberately sought to create something new and unexpected, especially at the expense of the natural beauty established by the great Renaissance masters Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, and Michelangelo, and they were thus perhaps the first modern artists. Parmigiano here has also distorted the natural poses for his own artistic purposes, creating a typical Mannerist figura serpentina, which is a style in painting and sculpture that's typical of Mannerism, similar to contrapposto, but featuring figures in a spiral or physically impossible pose. Jesus is also extremely large for a baby, and he lies precariously on Mary's lap as if about to fall at any moment. This is typical of Mannerism, creating an unexpected tension within the piece. The Madonna herself is hardly of human proportions. She's almost twice the size of the angels to her right, and her right foot rests on cushions that appear to be only a few inches away from the picture plane, and the foot itself seems to project beyond it, and is thus on our side of the canvas, breaking the conventions of framed picture. Her slender hands and long fingers are typical of the Mannerist style, later reproduced by many others. Lower right hand corner of the painting is an enigmatic scene with a row of marble columns and the emaciated figure of St. Jerome. A depiction of St. Jerome was required by the commissioner because of the saint's connection with the adoration of the Virgin Mary. St. Jerome is seen as very small, as if from a great distance away, but this is combined with columns much closer, giving another example of Mannerist disconnect. Therefore, we have seen the following typical features of Mannerism in the Madonna figure. elongated necks and fingers, the painting out of balance with more figures on one side than the other, figures distorted and overly large, about to fall, breaking the plane of the painting, and linear perspective being toyed with. Another artist I like is Angelo Bronzino. Here, with Venus, Cupid, and the Folly of Time, Bronzinus is showing the aforementioned Figura Serpentina with the impossible twisting of the Venus and Cupid figures. I also like this painting for the obvious shock factor favored by so many Mannerists, with Cupid actually holding Venus's left breast. Other pictures by the same artist include this portrait of a young man. Note the elongated fingers and use of colors. This portrait of a young lady. Note the disproportionate head to body size. And this picture of the Holy Family with the infant Saint John. Remember I said that Mannerism was in response to the Grand Masters of the Renaissance? Well, here we have Jacopo Tintoretto's version of the Last Supper. Compare it to the one more famous one by Da Vinci. In Tintoretto's, all the figures are set off to one side, creating that imbalance I previously spoke of. And we have the table sitting at an angle, again playing with the whole linear perspective idea, showing that the strict Renaissance way was not the only way to depict distances. Also note the use of light. There are two light sources, the chandelier and the halo from Christ's head, the latter of which far outshines the former and even casts shadows. Compare this to Da Vinci's use of more natural light and traditional use of linear perspective. Darn, I wish I knew how to use this program better. I would have shown you these two side by side. Another artist I like is El Greco. Here, in the Burial of Count Orga, we see his creative use of color creating caricatures of figures. In Dormition, he shows an interesting way to portray light, and the figures are once again overbalanced to one side. In Expolio, there is good use of linear perspective and the use of colors to highlight a central figure. Nevertheless, it's still somewhat of a caricature format. I especially like the vision of St. John because here he seems to almost predate and foreshadow the coming of 19th century impressionists like Gauguin and Van Gogh. And the Trinidad piece here, we can clearly see the Figura Serpentina once again. Finally, it should be noted that El Greco's portrait of the artist's son, George, has been often said to be the inspiration for Picasso's later piece several centuries later. No discussion of Mannerism would be complete without a mention of this artist, Archibald Giuseppe. Here, in his depiction of autumn, he uses common items like fruits, vegetables, and bark to compose a facial figure. He created many such figures, so the important thing to note here is the foreshadowing of Impressionism several centuries later and the creation of a new figure through artificial means. Kind of standing naturalism of the Renaissance on its head, right? Finally, no discussion would be really complete without a mention of Hieronymus Bosch. Although I was unable to find Bosch listed on most lists of Mannerist artists, I include him herein because of his obvious departure from the true and the mundane, his great use of caricatures and animated art. He slightly preceded the formal Mannerist era, producing his famous Garden of Earthly Delights here in 1510, shortly before the Mannerist era was scheduled to begin in Florence and Rome in 1520. Although it is true that there was a European branch of Mannerism centered in Fontainebleau, France, and it too emphasized incredible detailing over overall naturalism, like most European branches of art as compared to those in Italy, Mannerism occurred several decades after Bosch made his famous paintings. But I include it herein because of the similarity of style and purpose, its rebellion to classical Renaissance. Here in the Garden of Earthly Delights, we see figures in that serpentine fashion mentioned earlier, with limbs and figures elongated unnaturally, and the fact that many of the figures drawn were clearly the results of an overactive imagination again foreshadows expressionism and abstract art of several centuries later. In conclusion, Mannerism was more of a rebellion against the Renaissance than anything else. It was not a direct reaction to the Reformation or the Counter Reformation movements that would be left to the Baroque artists. It is an act of rebellion. They explored many new ways of depicting traditional figures like the Madonna as well as creating new ones. They developed new techniques like the serpentine figura, and they rejected traditional concepts of balance and linear perspectives. Their influence even extended into sculpture and architecture, seen here. There are several dozen other artists with works just as interesting and controversial, but I've selected those that have the most meaning for me. As one rebel from the 60s to another, across time, I salute them. I hope you enjoyed this videography. Thank you for watching.